This is A View from the Bunker. Now, here's Derek Gilbert.
Chronicling the long history of conflict between Islam and the West is a thankless task. Our guest can speak to that because he just passed his 10th anniversary of doing so on a monthly basis. He's also written a couple of histories, highly recommended, about the long, 14 centuries worth of warfare between Islam and Christendom. He's the author of such books as Sword and Scimitar, which I found profoundly educational, Crucified Again, The Al-Qaeda Reader, and a forthcoming project that we'll talk about when it is available. But in the meanwhile, satisfy yourself with those. It is our honor to welcome back to the program Raymond Ibrahim. Raymond, thank you for joining us tonight.
Hi, Derek. Very good to be with you again. Happy to have this conversation.
The 10th anniversary of your column that chronicles on a monthly basis persecution of Christians by Muslims around the world. What got that project started? And I guess as a quick follow-up, how difficult is it to do this month after month and see the same stories coming out again and again?
Yeah, that's a great question. So it started, like you said, it was over a decade ago. My first report I wrote was in July 2011, and the last one I've written actually has been for September 2021. So now we're 10 years and 2 months into it. But the reason I came up with it is I was one of the fields that I researched and wrote about was the Muslim persecution of Christians. And I specifically gravitated towards it because I saw not many other people doing it. It wasn't a pressing issue, though from what I was reading and seeing, oftentimes not from Western media, certainly not from mainstream Western media, mostly from small human rights groups, but also from non-English reporting, Arabic, and languages that are generally not accessible to most people. I noticed that this is an actual phenomenon with a lot of dots to connect, the Muslim persecution of Christians. So that's what got me to start it. I began it, and it's Gatestone Institute actually is the one that publishes it. So it's now been exactly 10 years. So what I do is I scour the internet. I speak to people actually in different hotspots and reporters. I look at, like I said, non-English, non-Western media. And for every month, I collate all the anecdotes and instances of persecution that arose. Not all of them, because there's too much. So I try to get, the most significant. But the more mild ones I end up leaving out, and on that front, it's interesting to note, and that it's enough to tell you that since I started in 2011 to today, one of the ideas I initially had when I came up, and I was like, okay, I'm going to write a report every month. You can't just have one or two instances. And I thought to myself, well, what if a month comes and there is only one or two or none? What am I going to do? It's sad to say, but that has never been the case. In fact, from then till now, in that decade, they've only grown and multiplied, and to the point that I've had to summarize and shorten and delete several. So that, in fact, at the time, I thought to myself, this might not be sustainable. It's actually gotten a lot worse, and at any given month, I can pull out a couple dozen of graphic instances of the Muslim persecution of Christians. So that's why I started it, and that's why it's continued for 10 years without any difficulties whatsoever. And I think you were asking me the second question, am I desensitized or is it tough to do this? It's certainly, I think I've become desensitized because in the beginning, it was shocking. And of course, I've known about this with my own background, the persecution that goes on in those countries. But, it was, of course, distressing and so forth. But I do think that, the more I've been reading and the more I'm involved and the more I talk to people, I have gotten a little desensitized, which might be good for the readership because I can do this without it being an issue for me, though it might be for other people. Because in reality, and we'll talk a little more about this, but in every one of these months, you have accounts, maybe half a dozen out of the one or two dozen that I include, that if these happened in a Western nation, and if it was, let's say, a Christian doing it to a Muslim, they would be just all over the media, 24 hours. They would be the biggest, most sensational stories. But because it's Muslims doing it to Christians, virtually nobody, including Christians, even knows that these sorts of things are going on, which again is one more reason for me to feel the need to actually do this project.
You've got kind of a unique upbringing here. Your parents are Egyptian. You're raised in the United States as a Christian. How was that upbringing in their experience shaped or influenced your understanding of what goes on in Muslim nations?
Sure. So my parents my mom and dad were both Egyptian Christians, Coptic Christians from Egypt. I was born here and raised here, as you say. So I had the added benefit of, being well acquainted with that culture, and including traveling to the Middle East, Egypt, and other countries, and of course, being a Native American. So I think that's helped. Those two parts of my mind complement one another to make to help make sense of this in a way that makes sense to Western people who don't get the full picture. So that definitely has helped. If you're an American, and you've never been to that country, if you don't speak the language, if you don't, most importantly, understand the culture, because you have to understand, Islam is not so much a rigid doctrinal system. It is that, and that is an issue. And when we talk about radical Muslims and fundamentalists, it's Muslims who, basically live out the letter of the Sharia law. But above and beyond that, people don't understand that it's sort of been, it infuses the culture. So even if you're not a radical Muslim, elements of this are in your life, and you end up. So in my mind, for example, what Muhammad did is he deified tribalism. He's a 7th century Arab, which is 100% a tribal culture and society. That's all they know. And tribalism is essentially we are one, everyone else is dirt, and we kill them, and they're like animals. They're just prey. If we can kill them, fine. If we can enslave them, if we can plunder them. That's all the reason we need is the fact that they're the other. So this is tribalism, 101. And I think what Muhammad did is he took tribalism and it turned it into, God says tribalism. And so now tribalism has become ossified, deified amongst that culture, to the point that even if you're not a religious or pious Muslim, elements of this tribalism are just in you because the tribalism precedes the religion. If anything, the religion has just now given it a divine veneer, making it harder to break away from. Because now it's not just something that's primordial or innate or cultural. Now it's something that God demands of you. So I think that actually is in my opinion, the forefront reason that you have Islamic animosity to the rest of the world, specifically Christians in this context, less so than So ISIS will come up and tell you, the Quran says, fight Christians and Jews, people of the book. And they'll quote verses 929, 95, and all this, fight the people of the book until they pay jizya and feel humbled in 929. But the average Muslim may not even know that, but they've sort of been, they're part of that tribalistic worldview where the other is the bad guy. And it doesn't even matter what they do. They need to know their place. They need to be, oppressed. And in fact, Islamic doctrine is one of the most pivotal one that few Americans or Westerners know. Is called, in translation, I translate it loyalty and enmity. In Arabic, it's called al-wala wal-bara. You can translate it to mean hate and love. And it basically, and it's founded on the Quran. And it comes down to simply, if you're a Muslim, you have to love and cooperate with Muslims, even if they're unjust to you. And you have to hate and fight non-Muslims, even if they're kind to you. Okay, and so, like I said, that makes sense to a tribalistic mentality because that's already where they're coming from. And that's why historically, if you look at who converted to Islam, it was tribal peoples. It was first the Arabs, then later the Berbers, nomads of North Africa, called Moors later on. It was the Turks, fundamentally tribalistic, and it was the Mongols, the Tatars, as they're called. So it's interesting, and when you look at the sources of Christian Europeans talking about the Muslims, whether they're Mongols or Turks or Arabs, they actually make this point. They go, because those tribalistic people, the religion of Muhammad actually comports with what they already know, rather than challenge them with, for example, Christian teachings. So Christian peoples already have if they're sincere believers, or even not sincere, as when it becomes part of the culture, they already have a certain worldview that's open to embracing the other. Whereas if you're a tribalistic person, the doctrine of Muhammad is tailor-made for you. It is tribalism, but now it's not because it's just, innate or primordial. It's because Allah commands it, which now gives it a veneer of holiness. And so it's interesting to see, the Turks and the Arabs and all these tribal people who never had a problem attacking and killing and enslaving the other. Once the Islam thing comes in, it becomes tribalism on steroids, because now it's not just we're going to do what we normally do. We're doing it because God wants it. This is for God. We're holy warriors. We're pious. We're altruistic. So I think, I think I digressed because you were asking me about my background. But I think it's important to keep that in mind, the tribalistic aspect, and not get so caught up on the ISIS types who just follow the letter of the law. They certainly do that, and that's certainly worse than what I'm talking about. But they're in the minority. The majority of the Muslims just see the world through us versus them. And they act on it in different levels.
What Muhammad did, and I drew this from Sword and Scimitar and some other works, the works of Dr. Timothy Furnish, for example, his research, which especially helped understanding their eschatology. But it seemed that what Muhammad did is he turned the long history of the Arab tribes, which was our tribe against the other tribe, to making Islam a super tribe. And so now you're okay. If you submit, which is what the word means, submit, then okay, you can go with us on the next caravan raid, and you get to keep all the stuff you can steal and all the women you can grab. And for a young guy who can swing a sword, that's a pretty sweet deal. And better yet, Allah says this is what you're supposed to do. So suddenly now you're not.
And then you go to heaven if you get killed.
Exactly.
And you get more women. You get supernatural women now.
Yeah.
So it's a win-win deal, and absolutely Muhammad did this, and it's interesting, as you say, even in Islamic historiography of Muhammad, there's the Mecca and Medina phase. Mecca is the early phase when he was just preaching, and he was weak and outnumbered, and he didn't war. And it's funny because at that time he had no followers. After 10 years or so of preaching, he had like maybe 100, most of them relatives. Okay, and it was only when he, went to Medina and actually became a warlord. I mean, realistically, and then they went on the jihad and started attacking caravans and enriching. That's when people started going to him in droves and converting to Islam. So even the actual conversion process, it was very much rooted to the idea of plundering the other. I mean, if you think of the main doctrines, okay, so like I told you, there's loyalty and enmity. It's all about us. They're bad. We fight them. Then jihad. Well, jihad is just plunder. The other Arabic word that became synonymous with jihad historically, especially with the Ottomans and the Turks, is ghazwa. Okay, and it's transliterated usually Ghazwa, and that's why the Muslim who does this is called a ghazi or a ghazi, depending on how they transliterate it. And that word simply means raid. So the Arabic word for to raid and plunder is synonymous with jihad, and they're used interchangeably. Okay, so holy warriors amongst the Turks are ghazis, but that word only means a raider and a plunderer. But it will be used interchangeably with a mujahid, a jihadist. Okay, and again, it just shows you it's just all about raiding and plundering on the other, but under the aegis of righteousness and doing it for God, which just completely, rather than challenge Christianity, would challenge this worldview. This worldview just emboldens and makes Muslim, pushes its adherents deeper into tribalism. And that's why, okay, so when you go to Europe and you see these enclaves of Muslims and this is why, because they are tribalism 101, or tribalism on steroids. They can't get along with the infidel or be part of their culture or cooperate with them. They have to hate them, and it's sad because the infidel, in this case Western leftists especially, make themselves extra repulsive, in my opinion, and to the point I can't blame the Muslim for not wanting to hold hand and go hand in hand with the leftist agenda and like them. If anything, they do have contempt for them, even more so than is required by their faith. So, it's a really bad, situation with all these ingredients.
That's the thing that really blows my mind, is that what I was trying to read up before I wrote my book, Bad Moon Rising, a couple of years ago, as I was looking at the spiritual aspects here and, getting speculative to a degree, because there's no there's no Vatican as such in Islam that sends out these dictates, and so and even if there were, I was trying to look behind that to see what the supernatural motivations were for a number of these things. But when you look at the actual history, as you've done in Sword and Scimitar and your other works, it seems pretty clear that the data shows that there is a long history of war that has taken place and plundering that's taken place. Robert C. Davis at Ohio State University, I guess it's the Ohio State University, back in 2003 wrote a book that should be shocking to people, where he pointed out that by his calculations, more than 1 million Europeans were probably enslaved by Muslim pirates between 1530 and 1780. That's between the time of Henry VIII and King George III. And the very first war that America fought as a new nation was against the Barbary pirates, because they were enslaving our sailors. They were stealing our stuff and enslaving our sailors. And yet,
quoting the Quran to justify it.
Right. When Jefferson and Adams were asking their ambassador in London, why are you doing this? Well, this is our religion. This is what we're supposed to do. And they couldn't get their heads around it. That hasn't changed much to this day, because you still have Western historians writing rather friendly histories of Islam. One, and I don't recall the author's name, but I wouldn't say it anyway. She basically excused the caravan raiding that Muhammad introduced as sort of his innovation on tribalism. Karen Armstrong, yes, thank you. You're right on it. She excused it away as by saying, well, they had to do this because there just weren't enough resources in Arabia. It's like, no, look, I'm sorry. When you're taking stuff that belongs to someone else on pain of death, that's just morally wrong. And I think most of the world's religions throughout history would have agreed, but Muhammad managed to turn that into a sacred act. And so I guess my question is, in 10 years of research and reading what Western academics have been writing about this practice that's been ongoing since the early 7th century, why don't Western academics get it?
I think because they have a certain, ideological blinders that just anything that goes against what they want to believe, they just won't accept. They don't care. They don't want to hear it. And what I'm talking about, and what we're talking about here, which is Muslims persecuting Christians just because a religion says so, flies in the face of what, the powers that be, the left, wants to say. They want to say the exact opposite. Their entire narrative is based on the fact that, the white man, which is, I think, synonymous with the Christian man, is the bad guy, and everyone else is a victim of him because the white man, the Christian, is a racist and blah blah blah. And but you stop and you stop and you take a look at reality and you find out no, it's really the opposite. You mentioned that historian. I'm familiar with what you're talking about the 1.2 million between 1580 and 17. But that's actually a very, and he even says it's a conservative estimate,
right?
And it doesn't count the real slave trades, Islamic slave trade. So Barbary was North Africa, the Muslims there, and they're the ones, of course, who attacked the United States. But if you looked at the slave trade under the Ottomans themselves, or the Tatars, the Crimean Khanate, which the word Slav, it really is etymologically rooted to slave, because to be a Slavic person was to be a slave of a Muslim for centuries. I mean, this is so. According to other historians, if you look at the totality of all these different Muslim groups throughout the centuries, it's something like maybe 10 to 15 million Europeans that actually got enslaved throughout the centuries. Okay, but that's not something we want to talk about, because what we want to talk about is that Americans, Europeans, white people are fundamentally racist. They instituted slavery. They're the only ones that do it, et cetera, et cetera. And so we don't need this story to just completely undermine and throw a wrench in our narrative, which is that Muslims actually enslaved more people, and not just Muslims. We can talk about everyone, who didn't do this. I recently wrote an article. It's about capability. And to me, that's the secret behind world history. It's not that that group is worse than that group. It's just they could do it.
Yeah.
So, imagine the Native Americans or sub-Saharan blacks in the 17th, 16th, 15th century. If they had the technology that Europe had, and Europe didn't, if they had, oceanic, galleons, and they had guns, and they had compasses, and they had advanced weaponry, and let's say, Europe was still living in tribe and tents and, spears and arrows, and then the natives came to Europe, or the Africans came to Europe, what would they do? Am I supposed to think that they would just look at them and say, we respect you, pale infidels, the savage, we're going to leave you to live in peace? No, I know what they would have done. And I think it makes whatever the Europeans did in, the 15th, 16th, 17th century pale in comparison, completely. Okay. And in fact, I say I know because there have been times when the Africans invaded Europe, the Moors. Okay. This is North Africa, but it was also sub-Saharan African slave soldiers who went into Europe and into Spain and into France, and all that they left behind was devastation, death, and destruction. At least we can say, the white man, the Christian, the European, he colonized, he did what he did, but he also brought the boons of the modern world of education, medicine, governance, all these sorts of technology. He at least brought that to the subject peoples. If you look historically at non-whites and what they did, they just went, destroyed, pillaged, ransacked, raped, and that was the end of it. That place was completely devastated. But the people who the guardians of the narrative obviously don't want this conversation to come out because they want it to be simple, black and white, white Christian, evil, and everyone else, good, innocent, victim of white Christian. Reality is really topsy-turvy to that.
Yeah, we saw that with just this week, a video from featuring a professor from Rutgers making exactly that claim that white Europeans were evil and inherently evil, and this is the fundamental premise of critical race theory.
And who canceled it? If you go back, slavery is all around the world. Who is the one that actually put a stop to it? It was Europeans, mostly driven by
English Christians, for the most part. Yeah.
Right? It wasn't Muslims, it wasn't, Africans, it wasn't natives, because all of them engaged in slavery and worse, and cannibalism. Right. And they actually were forced to stop. So I find it amazing and highly ignorant for anyone to, be on this idea where, the white man's a bad guy and everyone else is innocent. It's just it betrays an abysmal ignorance of, not just history, just common sense.
Well, human nature. I mean, it's
human nature. Exactly. That's what I'm saying. I believe humans are the same because I'm not a racist. But if you say one group of people, only white people, do bad things and enslave, that's because you're a racist. You are actually distinguishing different races in your mind. And even if you say the whites are bad and everyone else is good, you're still a racist because the word racist doesn't mean a white person doesn't like colored people. The word racist really means you distinguish between the races, okay? So even if I were to say something complimentary, like, Africans are athletic, okay? That seems complimentary. It is racist because I have distinguished them. I've said there's something different about them. So when I say all races behave the same when given a chance, which is to be, go on conquest and subjugate the other, okay? That is not a racist. But to say only one group, that just belies a very racist mentality. And again, it's pointless even saying that because people don't get it.
Yeah.
Well, they don't want to get it.
Well, exactly. And when you go back through history, you can find that there is, as far back as there's been writing, ancient Sumer, the Sumerians have records of slaves that were brought in from, and it was always the other. It was the Amorites or the Gudians or the Kashites or somebody else that they were enslaving and putting to work on their behalf. So this practice of punishing the other or exploiting the other or abusing the other continues to this day. I mean, again, your most recent monthly report for Gatestone Institute documents this again, and we're seeing now horrific things taking place in Afghanistan already, with the Taliban reportedly going door to door, executing Christians on the spot. It struck me today as I was thinking, how do we frame this conversation? How do we deal with this? And again, I think the thing that drives me most crazy, and it's got to absolutely drive you out of your mind, is the ignorance of the Western media, the willful ignorance of the Western media and Western academics. The only time, and I've been trying to pay attention to this now for 15 years or so, that we've heard anything about the destruction of Christian communities in the Middle East in the last 15 years. So back in 2014 and 2015, after the Islamic State declared a caliphate in June of 14 and began taking big swaths of territory in Syria and northern Iraq. One of our friends now, actually, who was a retired Marine, he and a buddy actually on their own dime flew back into Iraq, managed to buy weapons. He says, I don't recommend this for viewers at home, from an arms bazaar in one of the Kurdish regions, and defended Christian territories in northern Iraq. Jamie Walden is his name if viewers want to look him up. But this... In 14 and 15, we started finally seeing some stories about how Christian communities had been were being absolutely devastated by the Islamic State. But the fact is that most of the Christians had already fled Iraq after 2003, and we took out Saddam because suddenly then there was no protector. Saddam counted on the Christians as part of his coalition because he was nominally a Sunni and in the minority. So he needed the Yazidis and the Christians and to help kind of prop him up. And once we took Saddam out, then those who wanted to follow the teachings of Muhammad more closely had free reign to do against the Christians as they would. So we've gone from 2 million Christians in Iraq in 2003 to 125,000 now? But the media didn't pay attention until they wanted to provoke public support for a re-invasion and sending more troops back in there for whatever purpose the neocons had. Again, why so selective when it comes to, the poor Christians in the Middle East are being oppressed, when that's been going on since the early 7th century?
Yeah, good observation. So I would say first, which I think you're indicating, and I agree with, is that the media, which oftentimes works hand in hand, I think we've seen that dramatically lately with the government, wanted to create the narrative why we need to go in there. And they used the story of Christians and Yazidis and minorities being attacked under ISIS. So I agree with that. And I think the other thing is, whatever ISIS would do, and ISIS is the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria and so forth, also in Yemen later, Yemen and Libya later on. But whatever they would do, it was okay for the media because it could always be dismissed as this is a group that has nothing to do with Islam. These are radicals beyond extreme, and this isn't how real Muslims act. And to some extent, they're right because your average Muslim didn't really do that sort of thing vis-a-vis religious minorities, Christians, and so forth. So it was very easy to, on the one hand, use them to, bolster support for invasion. And on the other hand, you're really not demonizing Islam because, this is a radical way, whatever direction, right? I guess in this case, they want to label them. But what I found interesting is that, so ISIS and terrorists do spectacular attacks. They will bomb a church and kill 30, 40 people. Okay, or barge in and just open fire and kill and whatever. But like you're saying, before and after ISIS, so ISIS is really between late 2014 until 2017, 18, or 19 actually, whenever they start waning, even though they're still around, obviously. But during that high point, they did what they did, and it was okay to report it. But before that and after that, Muslims in general, which includes the average Muslim individual, which includes Muslim mobs, which includes religious clerics, which includes the authorities themselves, okay? Military authorities, the president, the parliament of an Islamic country, were all to lesser in sensational degrees engaged in one level or other of discrimination or persecution of Christians. And that never appeared on the media, which actually I think supports your point. With that, they were only using this for one particular agenda. Okay, if it was about human rights, way before ISIS, and right now, the issue with what's happening to Christians is more than enough. These reports that I've been writing for 10 years now, put aside ISIS, the sorts of things that happen every month. Okay, imagine a grown Muslim man who has 3 wives, goes and kidnaps an 11-year-old Christian girl, rapes her, and then says she's a convert to Islam, okay? And the girl's not allowed to speak to her parents. And then the judges side with the man and give the girl to him. That story has played out. I think I see that every 2-3 weeks.
Wow.
To the point that I read it and I go, wait, is this a repeat of what I read last week? And I figure it out, and no, it's a new story. Same exact thing, okay? Imagine that. That doesn't deserve some kind of media attention here in the West. You know, I thought we were these social justice warriors that can't handle, if you just using the wrong pronoun is the end of the world. But you can take a little girl and oftentimes little boys and rape them, and then the judge and the country itself awards the, so it's one thing to say the guy did what he did. He's a bad guy. He's a criminal. He's not a representative of Islam. But then the judge himself will actually agree with him. So imagine a story like that, okay? Or if you go to Egypt, all the time you get all this discrimination. You can't build a church. You can't even repair a church. And if you do, it's the end of the world, okay? And that's rooted in Islamic teaching. And all sorts of other things. And, and just, something recently that's been happening to me, which I'm shocked. Facebook locked me out, and I go on Facebook to put an article, and I'm done. And the next time I log in is to put another article. So I went in to log in and put in an article, and I found out I was locked out for 24 hours. And why? Because of an article I posted 8 months ago about what the Islamic State did to those 21 Christian Copts in Libya in 2015. And the reason I wrote it 8 months ago was I was translating an Arabic report about a movie being made about them in Egypt. So that was the theme. That's why I'm writing about it. But it was taken down. I was locked out. And I thought, is this some weird aberration? And then some people started contacting me saying, oh, this other article that you just wrote, very bland article, nothing graphic, but about persecution of Christians has been deleted. And now people are saying we can't even subscribe to your page. And I'm always shadow banned too, because I always get people saying, how come you haven't posted in 6 months? But I post every week several times, so they're obviously, they'll use this Christian persecution thing if they have a political agenda, as you pointed out. But it's actually not limited to ISIS. It's happening constantly. It's a nonstop thing. And it's happening from the highest levels of the government to the lowest levels of the mob and, of course, the religious authorities. But that, you're not going to be reading about that, in the BBC or CNN, or I might even say Fox News. It's not just a popular topic in reality,
We'd rather argue about Joe Biden and Donald Trump. The activist Linda Sarsour, who has been very
I
open.
have to laugh, and I have to tell you why, because her name means cockroach. Sarsour. I'm not kidding. In Arabic, that means cockroach.
Okay.
So every time I hear her name, I just can't help but laugh.
Interesting. She has been very outspoken about how wonderful it would be to see Sharia here in the United States, and was one of the founding members of the Women's March, which is a very radical left organization. How is it that here in the United States, you've got groups that are very liberal and reject really just about everything that serious Islamic scholars would accept as tenets of the faith? How is it that they can partner with somebody like Linda Sarsour?
Again, I think because it has nothing to do with reality. These people, the so-called left, okay, they should be the most people up in arms about what I'm talking about, right? In reality, if they heard me, and many of them do, not even me, they hear this, okay, this is happening, but they don't care. And the reason is because the whole human rights thing is for them a tool. It's not about actually helping a person. They don't care about that. It's, can I use it to further my agenda? And that's why you'll see in America and in the West in general, the feminists and the left and all these social justice warriors, all they do is attack basically the Western Judeo-Christian civilization, okay? Supposedly because they care about, women are suffering under the patriarchy, for example, okay? But if and homosexuals will argue the same thing, right? But if you tell them, homosexuals under the Islamic world are being executed outright, okay, it's not about a cake, right? They get thrown off a building habitually. Or if you tell the women there, what I was telling you, which is little girls are enslaved and married off and beaten, that's not an issue for them. And that to me is, proof positive. They don't care about human rights. What they care about is using it to make you feel guilty in a way that furthers their agenda, which is to undermine and destroy the Judeo-Christian worldview and civilization.
So what is Linda Sarsour and those like her who claim to be good Muslims? How can they justify what is their end game in rationalizing their alliance with progressives in the West?
The enemy of my enemy is my friend. The greatest enemy to these people is like I said, the Western Judeo-Christian culture. Okay, so they're willing to hold hand in hand and go with homosexuals and leftists. Even those are the groups of people that they hate the most. Okay, but hey, if those people will further their aims, yeah, we'll work with you for now. Okay, it's just the classic enemy of my enemy is my friend. Who's the greater enemy? The greater enemy to them is not the left, which is, and that's a whole other thing. I think we need to change. We need a real word. Okay. I don't know this, we're fighting a direction, and when we use the left, we also kind of, we give it legitimacy because the subconscious idea is there's a center, the moderate, and then there's a right, and then there's a left. Well, that kind of puts them on the same moral footing in a way, right? And I think it's time to do away with that. I think better than right and left, we should maybe right and wrong.
There you go.
Maybe we should call them the wrong. But I would really hope that bugs me, and because words are important in a war, in anything. You know your enemy, Sun Tzu. So I really hope we get to a point where we can move beyond the left, because I think that just totally masks what we're dealing with. But I digress. I'm sorry about that. Linda Sarsour and these people, like I said, it's just the enemy of my enemy is my friend. Who's the greater threat? Who's my real enemy? And it's the same thing with the left. I got to use that word. They ally with Muslims, even though they know they hate them and have contempt for them and want to kill the homosexuals and want to put women in harems and whatever, right? But that's okay, because the real enemy for both groups is that Judeo-Christian construct. That's what needs to go. So they'll work hand in hand, and then if and when that time comes that they've eliminated their true enemy, you can rest assured they'll be at each other's throat.
First against the wall once they come to power.
Yep. That's it.
What is the risk, do you think? Just a few minutes left here. What is the danger that Islam becomes ascendant here in the United States?
Realistically, it's certainly a concern, but what I'm seeing is just all these kind of what we just said, all these different forces that are very disparate and have nothing to do with one another, but their commonality is to hate, law and order and righteousness and truth. Okay, that's what binds them together, just that. And so, whether it would be Islam or Sharia that would finally gain prominence, or whether it would be some crazy, wild, transsexual leftist, governance that would, like I said, they will work with each other because they see themselves as the underdogs, trying to overthrow the real enemy. And then when and if that time comes, how they're going to sort it out. But certainly the Islam agenda is way out there. I think, when it's all said and done, and if you just have the left versus Islam, you may very well see Islam take over just because they're more aggressive, and the left, vis-a-vis brown non-Christians, have to be paralyzed and passive and just take it because that's how it is, right? That's what they preach. So very much, I think the Islam agenda could, in the end, when it's all said and done, if there's no vigilance, rise up to be supreme.
The bottom line, though, is in the short term, what they're looking at is chaos here in the United States, which, again, we get back to critical race theory and just critical theory, which argues that any system in the West is a product of the patriarchy and the European patriarchy, and thus must be dismantled. Of course, the irony there is once they dismantle that and set up another system, well, then they got to tear that one down too, because any system is inherently oppressive, and you've got the oppressors and the oppressed. It's chaos. And
they remind me of the medieval philosophical notion of evil, which is the absence of the good. It's a negative force. They simply exist to overthrow the positive. They have nothing to offer, and they become extinguished in and of themselves because there's nothing there. Mm-hmm. They're just almost like a cancer or a parasite that wants to kill the real thing. And once they do, they themselves will die because there's nothing to feed off of, right?
I think you're absolutely right. Well, that is why we men of the West must continue to be vigilant and train up our children, our grandchildren, in the way they should go. Raymond Ibrahim writes at RaymondIbrahim.com. He also writes for the Gatestone Institute. I'll put links in the show notes. And his books, Crucified Again, Exposing Islam's New War on Christians, and most recently, Sword and Scimitar, 14 Centuries of War Between Islam and the West. You see me tilting my head because the progressive lenses, as we spoke off camera earlier, Raymond, you get to that age, you got to start expanding the font, making the font bigger on the screen. Thanks again for your time tonight, and we truly appreciate your work. We'll have you back when your new book is ready.
Absolutely. Thanks very much, Derek. Happy to do it.
Coming up, some thoughts on Islam's role in the end times as A View from the Bunker continues.
Where were you on 10/13? As the Middle East erupts in chaos, a devastating wave of terror shocks the nation. Thousands lie dead. An apocalyptic Christian cult is blamed. And suddenly, believers disappear as internment camps spring up almost overnight. Meanwhile, a deadly virus spreads. A desperate country demands answers, and only a few dare ask, what's in the vaccine? FBI Special Agent Joe Eunice follows a trail of evidence to a small town in Iowa and a young boy who received a mysterious email from God. Now, racing against time, Agent Eunice finds himself working side by side with reclusive internet broadcaster Barney Eisen. Together, they discover a disturbing truth at the center of the conspiracy. They wrestle not against flesh and blood. The God Conspiracy, a novel by Derek P. Gilbert. Get it now in paperback and Kindle. From Rose Avenue Fiction.
Talking the walk from the beautiful Missouri Ozarks, this is A View from the Bunker. You'll find us online at VFTB.net. You'll also find us on social media, Twitter at View from Bunker, or my personal account at Derek Gilbert. That's Derek. As long as they'll keep me on there anyway. Facebook, View from the Bunker is where the page is found. You can log in there, leave your thoughts about the program. Also on Gab, MeWe, Getter, and Parler. You'll find me there at Derek P. Gilbert on those locations. What is Islam's role in the end times? That was the reason I wrote the book, Bad Moon Rising. Necessarily speculative, because whenever you deal with end times prophecy, you are getting speculative. But when you've got a religion that is on track to become the world's largest within the next 50 years, and your end times scenarios don't include what happens to Islam, you're really not taking it. I don't think your end times scenario is complete. I think it's too easy to just say it's going to be, with all due respect to the scholars and students of prophecy who have come to this conclusion, I think it's a little too obvious to say that the Antichrist will be the Mahdi. I think that's just a little too obvious. Credit to Chris White for getting me thinking along these lines. I think Islam is essentially going to be used as cannon fodder by the fallen realm to draw Jews and Christians, if we're still here on the earth when that time comes, into worshiping the Antichrist. I think the most plausible scenario, and this I laid this out in some detail in Bad Moon Rising, is that there will be a war, perhaps a Psalm 83 war. Bill Salas has written about this in his book. He put that out there some years ago. Basically, the nearby neighbors of Israel go to war with Israel, and then a very dynamic religious government military leader rises up and leads Israel to an overwhelming victory, perhaps even fulfilling the land promise God gave to Abram in Genesis 15 to the full. And that's a lot of territory occupied by a lot of Arabs, Druze, etc. Right now, it would not be politically expedient for Israel to do so without a major war of conquest. Well, anyone who would lead Israel to that kind of a victory over its aggressive neighbors and restored to Israel that land promised by God to Abraham would be, I think, welcomed as the Mashiach, the Jewish Messiah. But if you read Daniel chapter 10, Daniel chapter 11, the last verses of Daniel 11, it reads like the wars of Antichrist. And again, Chris White gets credit for getting my thinking moving in this direction. It is not a popular theory, because if this theory is correct, that means the one that we Christians call Antichrist would be a very prominent Israeli leader. Now, please understand, I'm not saying he would be a Jew, because I don't think an actual legitimate Jew would do to Israel what this character is going to do, but he will present himself as one so that he's welcomed by the rabbis as the false Christ, the false Messiah. But Islam, I think, will be absolutely destroyed prior to that. And that is why I don't think there's really any purpose in trying to figure out who's the Mahdi. Is it Erdogan? Is it Bashar al-Assad? Is it Mohammed bin Salman? I don't think so. I don't think I don't think it will be a Muslim Antichrist. I think, as some of the early church did, for example, Irenaeus, who was a student of Polycarp, who in turn was a student of John, who wrote the book of Revelation, that it's very possible that this figure called the Antichrist will present himself as a Jew. Irenaeus went so far as to speculate that he would come from the tribe of Dan, because of certain prophecies about Dan coming from Bashan, and the spiritual significance of the area around Mount Hermon and Bashan. So anyway, I think that's the role that Islam has to play in the end times. I do agree with Joel Richardson, while I disagree with him about the nature of the Antichrist being Islamic. I do agree with him that Mecca, and in particular, and Islam in general, is Mystery Babylon. Here's something else, and this is just another example of how, with additional study, I shift my opinions or my conclusions on prophecy. I wrote in Bad Moon Rising, and I proposed a different identity for Allah than I had seen anywhere else before. And I argued that Allah was not a single entity, but a coalition of the old gods of Mesopotamia who'd been taken by surprise by the resurrection of Jesus Christ. We read this in 1 Corinthians 6, verses 6 through 8, where Paul, summarizing, paraphrasing, said that the archons of the age, the rulers of the age, didn't understand the mystery that God was revealing through the prophets and the apostles. As if they had, they would not have crucified the Lord of glory. But they did. They didn't know that they were actually fulfilling Christ's mission by sending him to the cross. And so they had to come up with a plan B. And so they invented a religion that not only targeted Christians in particular for violent conquest, enslavement, and so forth, but offered an alternate religion with an alternate path of salvation, and made it very attractive for young men. Hey, I can steal all the stuff I want, have all the women I want. If I die in the effort to trying to get those things, I go to heaven, as Raymond said in the first part of the program, and I get these supernatural women. And also, if you read carefully the Quran, young boys as well in the afterlife. So I think that I am shifting my opinion on the identity of Allah. As I wrote in Bad Moon Rising, the name appears to be, and not all scholars, there's some question as to whether this is correct or not, but there are scholars who believe that the name Allah comes from Al-Ilah, the God, which may be derived from an older Akkadian Il-Ilu, which is Semitic, based on the word El, meaning God. And in my forthcoming book, The Second Coming of Saturn, I argued that that is actually the name of the chief god of Mesopotamia, Enlil. Scholars used to think that that name was derived from Sumerian, meaning Lord Ether, En, Lord, Lil, Ether, wind, whatever. But they are coming to believe now that it actually derives from Il-Ilu, because the Akkadian form is Elil, Enlil for the Sumerians. So it may be, and in the book I'm arguing that this entity is the one that we will know as Abaddon or Apollyon when the pit opens up, because he's also Shemayaza. of Genesis chapter 6. That's the theory in the forthcoming book, The Second Coming of Saturn, also called Saturn, Kronos, Baal Haman of the Phoenicians, and so forth. So I'm suggesting now that I'm going to have to write another book, apparently, but it's okay, maybe this coalition idea works, that Allah was just sort of invented a simulacrum or a puppet, an Oz-like figure that is operated by these gods behind the scenes, desperately trying to come up with an answer for the resurrection. But it may also be this entity who is now chained in gloomy darkness until the judgment, according to Peter and Jude, leader of the rebellion on Mount Hermon, who went by many different names throughout history, including Enlil or Il-Elil or Il-Ilu or Allah. He's in the abyss now, but still influencing humanity through his demonic minions. His children, demons, being the spirits of the Nephilim destroyed in the flood. And the Nephilim, of course, created by this rebellion on the summit of Mount Hermon. So, I reserve the right to be wrong and to correct my theories at a later date if I think I've come up with better research. So that may be an updated version of Bad Moon Rising in the future. That's where I stand right now on this entity in the abyss who is going to come out for 5 months at the end of history, just before the final judgment. We've kind of reached the end of the conference season for 2021, except that the SkyWatchTV Defender Conference continues, the virtual conference, through January 15th. If you haven't seen it yet, if you haven't signed up and taken advantage of it yet, you can still binge watch 24 presentations plus the world premiere of the documentary film The Great Delusion about the UFO phenomenon, the UFO UAP phenomenon, and alien abduction. And there are a number of presentations that are based on that theme. I did a talk on the book that Josh Peck and I co-authored called The Day the Earth Stands Still. My presentation is on Aleister Crowley and the occult origins of the modern ancient aliens beliefs. Joe Jordan, who's the president, co-founder of the CE4 research group, CE4 meaning Close Encounters of the Fourth Kind, deals with those who believe they're being abducted or tormented by extraterrestrials, aliens, and showing those poor experiencers and contactees that it's actually demonic, not extraterrestrial. Don't miss that one. And the documentary itself, Josh has done a masterful job of putting it together. It features contributions from Tom Horn, L.A. Marzulli, Russ Dizdar, who's recently gone home to be with the Lord. And by the way, prayers for Shelley Dizdar, who is still recovering and in hospital. So, and Chris Putnam, Noah Hutchings, many others. He even found a spot for me in that documentary. But you can find out more and take advantage of the time that remains. Binge watch on your schedule as often as you like and as many times as you like, or in any order that you like, through January 15th of 2022. Come next year, we pray for some clarity regarding the travel situation to Israel, because we want to return to the Holy Land sooner rather than later. We were blessed to see our good friend Messianic Rabbi Zev Porat and his wife Lynn here in the Ozarks just recently, but we want to see them on their home turf. March 20th through April 4th of 2022, the dates for the SkyWatch TV Tour of Israel. Search for the travelers being the term used by the pagan Canaanites for the demonic spirits of the Rephaim. This is a tour that will include Gilgal Rephaim on the Golan Heights, what they call the Stonehenge of Israel, the newly recognized Serpent Mound of Bashan, just a quarter mile away. I mean, this thing makes the Serpent Mound in Ohio look like an earthworm. It's 3/4 of a mile long, so it's like 3 times longer and 5 times higher, and it's covered with megalithic tombs. Cairns, dolmens, so forth, 140 of them, which haven't been excavated for some reason. So we will go there, and of course we'll see all the sites that you'd want to see on a tour of Israel: Jerusalem, the Jordan River, Nazareth, the Sea of Galilee, and so on. You can get a complete look at the sample itinerary and a breakdown of costs online at skywatchinisrael.com, skywatchinisrael.com, and we are working on details for perhaps a tour of Turkey, which would include the Churches of Revelation, Göbekli Tepe, and more. So we'll keep you posted on that. That will be probably a small group. As of right now, Turkey is not requiring travelers to be vaccinated. So we're looking at that and trying to find dates where we can slot it into the 2022 calendar. Appreciate you taking time out to watch or listen wherever you consume podcasts. We're at Spreaker, Stitcher, iTunes. Well, it's not iTunes anymore. It's Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Amazon Music, iHeartRadio, Spotify, or wherever else fine podcasts are sold. Give us a like on Facebook. And remember, our announcer is DC Good, and A View from the Bunker is a production of Gilbert House, released under Creative Commons Attribution, Non-Commercial, No Derivatives 4.0 International License. We do this because we wrestle not against flesh and blood. I'm Derek Gilbert, and this is A View from the Bunker.